Hey, did you know that plastic is produced with oil, a fossil fuel that pollutes the environment? Wouldn't it just be awesome if we could live our lives without plastic? Well, there's a company that wants to help you do just that. Life Without Plastic. They sell products that will reduce or eliminate your dependence on plastic. They have a large selection of products like toothbrushes, food storage containers, drinking straws. And the best part is that they're also very reasonably priced. So what are you waiting for? Check out all these great plastic-free products and help save the planet. Just click on the link in the show notes to find out more and to start your journey to being plastic-free. Hello, friends, and welcome to the Nature Wanderer podcast. I'm Paul, and today I am in the safety of my own studio. You see, I say the safety because if you hear in the background, I am playing an audio of the sounds of where I was. And I'll be quiet for a minute here just that you can listen. If it sounds like boulders moving, that's what it is. Boulders knocking against each other as I'm walking on top of them. I wandered a little bit far this time. I went down to Pennsylvania, the Poconos, on a family vacation. So I was with my kids and my grandkids down in a town called Albrightsville, Pennsylvania. And the one morning we decided to head over to Hickory Run State Park, which was not too far away. And one of the destinations in the park that I wanted to head to, besides all the really neat hiking there, was a place called the Boulder Field. Hickory Run Boulder Field. Now, before I explain what the Boulder Field was and what it was like, I'll explain why I'm in the studio instead of recording at the site. I tried recording at the Boulder Field, but you're walking on boulders. And as you can hear, the boulders are shifting underfoot sometimes. Most of them are pretty sturdy, but every once in a while you'd hit a loose one and it would kind of rock against another one. Your footing is not level. And I grew up with weak ankles when I was a kid. When I was very young in elementary school and middle school, I probably sprained both my ankles half a dozen times. I'm going to go a little further and say probably about a dozen times each ankle. So my ankles have always been very weak. And because of that, as an adult, my ankles are still rather weak all the time. So I'm very careful with my footing. And I've sprained my ankles as an adult because of my weak ankles. I mean, I'm an active guy. I mean, nowadays, I do yoga, and you're thinking that's not active. Well, some of it is. But I'm always hiking. I'm always walking places. I always tell my wife, if I'm sitting too long, check my pulse. I might be dead. Yeah, I always have to be moving. I always have to be active. I always have to be doing something. That's just how I am. And as a kid, double that, triple that, quadruple it. I was really active. I was so active, I was jumping off park benches. I was running around all the time. And that's why I sprained my ankles a lot. And because of that, I went to this boulder field. And imagine I'm at this state park, Hickory Run State Park. And I was at the Hickory Run Boulder Field. We drove through this winding dirt road, bumpy road, finally got to the parking area. You walk to the end of the parking area and you go through the woods just a little bit. I mean, probably about 20, 30 feet. And you end up right in front of this big open area. That is the boulder field. Before you is just all these big rocks. And there's people out there. You probably heard them in the background on my recording. There's people all over these rocks just walking along them. And here I am knowing how weak my ankles are. So what do? Well, of course, I just stand there. No, I had the challenge before me. So I had to check it out. And of course, after I got out there a little bit and I'm walking around on the boulders, a few of the family members, a few of our groups are heading back towards our entrance onto this boulder field. Well, some of us just kept going. And of course, I see the other side, and you gotta know what's on the other side, right? So I had to keep going all the way to the other side, and I did. So let me describe this boulder field. First of all, it's located in Hickory Run State Park, which is a 16,000-acre state park in Carbon County, Pennsylvania. Now, in a corner of this state park, there's this boulder field. It's mostly wooded in this park. Lots of beautiful trails. We did do some hiking too. We went on some hiking trails. But the highlight to me was the boulders. And I think my grandson and my son-in-law agree with me. But the boulders were just an awesome experience to go on. So you get to the boulder field. The boulder field is about 16 acres. It is the largest boulder field in the Appalachian Mountains, or you can say Appalachian. I've heard it pronounced both ways. I've always called it the Appalachian. It's about 400 feet wide and about 1,800 feet long. Now, they estimate that it's about 10 to 12 feet deep. Now, as we were hiking along or tiptoeing along this boulder field, we did come across a couple of craters down in the boulder field. Now, I kind of felt that people probably want to see how deep it is, so they started pulling the boulders out and they started setting them aside, but I really didn't see any mounds of boulders anywhere. I was doing some research afterwards, and a lot of the research was saying that if you come across these craters, what happened was the weight of the boulders actually pushed against the ground, and where there was a soft spot, it basically collapsed in. Now, these holes, I actually had to go crawling down into one. This crater that I crawled down into. Now, mind you, the crater is maybe 6 to 10 feet wide. But when I got down in it, I could still see around me. And I'm about 5'10", so I'm looking around and I could still see all the craters around me. So where I was standing, I'm going to guess it was maybe 4 to 5 feet deep. But still, that's pretty deep. So you're talking 10 to 12 feet deep. So I'm walking around on these boulders, thinking about doing my podcast, and I found that as I'm concentrating on talking to my wife who went a little ways with me, or my son-in-law, my grandson who went the entire distance to the other side with me, I'm talking with them, I found I'm not concentrating on my footing as much. So as I was talking, it was more very slow, very paused, because I was concentrating more on my footing. Now on the way back, I was a little more confident, and I did go a little bit faster, but on the way across, I was watching every single step. That's why I'm in the studio today. I didn't want to sprain my ankle again. I didn't want any gashes. My grandson did fall a couple of times on these boulders because it's not easy walking on them. Now, mind you, the boulders, they're probably about 4 foot on average in size, but there were some that were much bigger and some that were smaller. Now, closest to the end where we entered the boulder field, they're mostly rounded. Some were loose, like I said. You'd step on one thinking, oh, nice and solid, and then all of a sudden you step on one of these boulders and it just gets loose. It moves and rubs against another boulder. You probably heard some of them knocking in the background noise I was playing earlier. And that's what I was running into a lot. So I was taking my time, making sure that I was going nice and slow. Now, the further out you got, the fewer people you had as well. There were a lot along the entrance. But as you got way out, there were very few people. When I got to the other side, there was just one small family, I think it was maybe 6 people, who were on the other side up on the land out of the boulder field. And they were just sitting there relaxing out of the sun in the cool shade. And other than that, it was just me, my grandson, and my son-in-law. It was just the 3 of us. So it was very peaceful on the other side. But the rocks changed too. The rocks were more ragged. It was tougher to walk on those. There were more jagged edges. There were more loose rocks. So it was a lot harder to walk. It took a lot more concentration to think about your footing on those rocks. Now, most of the rocks are sandstone. If you're unfamiliar with sandstone, it's a sedimentary rock. We're getting into geology here a little bit, so bear with me. But sedimentary rock, sandstone, just like the name says, sand. It's basically a lot of very small sand particles that are compressed together over thousands, millions of years. They get compressed together, forming a rock. Sandstone. Now, every once in a while, you'd see another stone that just kind of stands out. Because these sandstones are essentially all gray in color, or a brownish gray. They say that it was red sandstone, but I really didn't see a lot of red in it. It was mostly kind of a grayish color, maybe a little bit of reddish brown in them. But then every once in a while, you run across a quartz conglomerate rock. Now, a conglomerate rock is a lot of small rocks that are inside of a bigger rock. So these small rocks were in mud, in sand, and they got compressed together. They got cemented together with another type of rock. In this case, it was quartz. So it cemented these together, forming a rock that has all these little rocks inside of it. So they really stood out from the sandstone. So that's what we were walking on. That's what this field was made out of. Now, occasionally, as you're walking through this boulder field, you would come across a tree, usually more towards the edge. Now, there were a couple, one on the entrance side and one on the far side. Well, I think there were a couple on the far side, but there were a few that really stood out. Now, most of the forest around the boulder field was a coniferous forest, pine forest. And those trees that were in the middle were also pines. Now, one on the far end was out in the middle of this boulder field, and it was dead. There wasn't any life to it. But there was one very much alive. It was probably about, I'm going to guess, maybe 8 foot tall. And it was growing right out of the boulders. You see, what happens is leaves from the trees around the boulder field will blow into the boulder field, and they sit there on the rocks. Now, as those leaves decay, the leaves turn into soil. And a seed from the pine tree will actually get planted in that soil, and it will start to grow. Now, you may ask, where is it getting its moisture from? I mean, you have all this drainage, boulders. Where's the water going? It's going around the boulder and it's draining down into the ground 12 feet under. But remember, this tree built soil going up towards the top of the boulders. So it's in soil, and that soil is gathering the rainfall before it can drain off. So that's how it can keep growing. And the roots, I'm sure, go quite deep, down below the boulders. As a matter of fact, this is a natural process where leaves will constantly fill in between rocks and they will basically decay into soil. New trees, new plants will start growing out of that soil. So this boulder field is actually shrinking over time. You can't watch it. I mean, you can go back every year and it'll probably look exactly the same because it takes a long time, hundreds of years. So that boulder field is going to be there for many years to come. It'll probably still be there when I'm not around. So don't worry about rushing there to get to see it because, like I said, it's taken a long time for this filling in to take place. But yes, every year, maybe by a ½ inch, ½ inch, it is shrinking. So that's going to happen. That's why these trees are out there in the middle, because of the leaves, the decay, and the plants are growing out of that soil between these rocks. So how did these rocks form? I mean, why are they there? Was it aliens that carried them there? No. They used to think that it was glacial still. This boulder field formed around, not too long ago, about 20,000 years ago. During the last ice age is when the boulder field formed. So the original theory, their thought, was that, well, it was glacial still. What glacial still is when a glacier is moving. Glaciers don't stand still. If it did, it wouldn't be considered a glacier, it would be considered snow. So this glacier is moving slowly. And as it does, you're talking a really huge glacier. It's probably hundreds of feet thick, and it's really wide too. All that weight is just bulldozing along the ground, and it's pushing all this sediment along as it does it. It's moving huge boulders, huge rocks. And then as the glacier recedes, as it starts melting and pulling back, it leaves behind all of the still, the rocks, the boulders, the dirt, everything that it plowed up in its path, it's leaving behind. That's what we call glacial still. But they did some studies, and they actually found that the glacier had stopped a mile or two before you get to the boulder field. Through some research, they did find that some of the boulders did roll, move, slide to where they are, but no more than a mile. So the glacier stopped before the boulder field, which means that the glacial still theory didn't hold up. So doing more research, they concluded that it's actually from the glaciers, or I should say the glacial period. See, during the glacial period, there's a lot of times of freezing and thawing. Now, in the rock, you do have small cracks. So here you have this big platform of rock, solid rock. You ever walk on a mountain or a hillside or some area where it's very rocky, and you realize I'm walking on top of one huge boulder? It's like that in the Adirondacks when I've been there. I've seen it out west in the state of Washington. Around where I live in New York, there's Little Rock City where it's one big boulder. When I've gone up to Algonquin National Park, you climb some of the mountains and you'll find on the top there's all these huge rock platforms. So this is what you had here. You had this big section of flat rock, and all of a sudden, you've got the glacier melting. The water from it is flowing over the boulders, or I should say over the solid rock, which has cracks in it. Where's the water going to go? Well, gravity's in play here. So the water would seep into the cracks. It would sit there, and then you have a freeze. It gets cold. What happens to water when it freezes? It turns to ice, but when it's turned to ice, it actually expands. So the water is expanding, taking up more space. And believe it or not, it has a lot of power when it does this. It has enough power to push the rock apart, cause that little crack to become a little bit bigger. Then as it melts, it goes deeper into the rock because now you have a bigger crack. And that crack is filled with water. When it freezes, it expands, and the crack opens even more. The water melts, goes deeper, freezes, splits, melts, goes deep, and eventually it's working its way all the way down through this rock, and it breaks it apart into two pieces, shatters it down. Now, I saw this when I was down out west in Arches National Park. A lot of the arches they were explaining were formed in this same way. When water gets between the rocks and then it freezes, it separates the rocks and they crack and fall. So the softer rock on the bottom of this arch is breaking away, and eventually through erosion, it breaks away to the point where it just flows away, and you have an arch left behind. And that's what was happening in this boulder field. From constant freezing and thawing, the water breaking the rocks apart, then you had slurry. Remember, these glaciers are melting, mixing with mud, mixing with sand, causing a slurry. The slurry is doing two things. First of all, it is causing the rocks to slide. So water comes down, is pushing against these rocks, which have a nice slurry, a nice ooey goo to just slide along on, and they move. And this is what I was talking about. They found that these rocks have probably moved about half a mile to a mile from their original location. And while they're moving, they're also getting weathered down. So they're rounding off. Instead of being sharp-edged boulders that broke off from the original rock into smaller pieces, the edges are getting worn away and they become rounded. So that's what's forming these boulders. Now, another thing that was happening at the same time, or shortly thereafter, was frost heave. So you still have, you're in Pennsylvania, northern climate. We get the same thing here in New York State. Winter, summer, winter, summer. So every year you're getting frost heave. I know every once in a while I have to reset my shed, the pillars, because the frost pushes up on it. The footers were not set properly. So the shed, some of them will heave, others won't. So I have to adjust them every once in a while by putting a board under one pillar just to even everything out. Well, that's what was happening with this boulder field. You would get the frost pushing up on these large boulders from underneath and pushing them through the smaller rocks. So what happened was the smaller rocks ended up down at the bottom of the boulder field, while the larger boulders were up towards the top. So all of this is how this boulder field was created. Now, underneath this boulder field, you have all this water because you're in a trough, a valley. If you look at the boulder field, when you first walk up to it, it looks like it's level to the ground. You don't have to climb up to walk on the boulders. You just walk right off of the land, right onto the boulders, and you can just keep walking across. Now, there is a slight decline in the altitude, but you don't really see it. You don't really feel it, but through scientific measuring, they have found that it does slant a little bit. So here you have the forest on both sides behind it. You have the rain coming along. You have the runoff from the forest. Where's it all going? Down into this trough. Like I said, it's like 10 to 12 feet deep, filled with boulders. Now, the boulders are not going to hold back the water. So the water is going between the boulders, seeping down to the bottom and running along. Now, when I was there a couple weeks ago, it was very dry. They were in a dry spell. There wasn't much water around, except in the woods where our cottage was. It seemed so damp there all the time, but that's because we're in the woods. But they were experiencing a dry spell. But they say that if it rains a lot, you will actually hear the water running underneath the boulders. That is actually the start of Hickory Run, which is a creek that runs through the state park. So like I said, if you do get a chance to go here, if it has rained, try to find a nice quiet area without a lot of people around and just stop and listen. And they say that you can hear the water running underneath. I couldn't hear any, but like I said, I was there when it was a dry spell. Now, what about wildlife around? Well, after we did the boulder field, we did go back to the visitor center and we checked out their displays in their wonderful visitor center. One of the best displays I've seen explaining the area, the park, the boulder field. It was very well done. So we went in there and I read as much as I could because that's just what I like to do. I like to learn as much as I can. And I learned a lot about this boulder field, got more information, and I discovered that because of the forests around the boulder field, there are a lot of animals, wildlife, that visits it. I mean, of course, you have like the crows, which we did see quite a few, crows, ravens, other birds that like to hang out there because if there's a small animal walking along the boulders, they're out in the open. They're easy to get at, unless they sneak down between some boulders. So it's probably still tough hunting, but the birds that eat other animals, they still hang out there. And they did show some pictures at the visitor center of some black bear on the boulders as well. We didn't see a lot of wildlife when we were there. I did hear some birds around coming from the woods. We did see some crows flying over, some birds flying over the boulder field. But it was a sunny day. Most of the animals were in the woods trying to stay cool. Now, there is one wild animal that we saw quite a bit of while we were crawling on the boulders. And I saw more of them as I got towards the far end of the boulder field. And that is our lovable, friendly wolf spiders. So if you're not a spider fan, you might want to avoid the boulder field. There were just tons of them all over the rocks. It's a great location for them. They have plenty of places to hide, plenty of places to find food as the insects are crawling between the boulders. So they were just very numerous throughout the boulder field. But as soon as you got close to them, you didn't really have to worry about stepping on them. They felt the vibrations of you coming, and they would usually scurry down between the boulders. Now, the last thing I want to talk about with this boulder field, since we're running out of time here, is the donut dimples. I kept seeing every once in a while, it wasn't very common, but every once in a while I saw these little round donut shapes on the boulders. Now, these donut shapes are probably only about 2, maybe 3 inches in diameter. And it almost looked like someone took a round drill, and tried drilling out. And the drill didn't work, and it left these donuts. So it was really interesting. And I was trying to figure out, are these man-made or are they natural? Now, when I went into the visitor center, I looked it up. I tried to find a display. I asked the lady about the dimples, and she says it's a mystery. No one really knows what's caused those dimples. They don't know if they're man-made. They don't know if they're natural. But these dimples, donut dimples, they were in several places. I think I saw maybe 3 of them as I was walking along the boulders. But nobody knows. Maybe those aliens were the ones who brought them. I don't know. But anyhow, that's the Hickory Run Boulder Field in the Poconos. We had a great time when we were there. That was one of the highlights, other than spending a lot of time with my family. That was the best part of the entire weekend. But the Boulder Field was a highlight too. I highly recommend going and seeing it. You can learn a lot about geology when you're there. Learn about the rocks. Don't miss out on the visitor center. And if you have an electric car, free charging for your electric vehicle at the visitor center. I charged up my car a little bit while I was out on a hike on some of the trails. So make sure you go there, visit it. I enjoyed it. My family enjoyed it. It's a great place for the kids. Of course, my really young grandkids, they didn't go climbing on the rocks because it's not really great for really small kids. If you don't have good footing, you're afraid to walk on unsteady surfaces, I also recommend you don't go and walk on the rocks, but at least get there and explore it. Well, that's about all the time we have for today. I'd like to thank you for joining me. I hope you enjoyed wandering through nature with me today, even if it was in the studios. Hey, I saved my ankles by concentrating on where I was walking. But don't forget to invite your nature-loving friends to join us next time. If you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button. Take a minute to rate and review the podcast. If you have any nature questions or ideas for future episodes, feel free to drop me a DM on my Instagram page at @thenaturewanderer, underscores in between each word, or my website at naturewanderer.org. You can also support the podcast by joining my Patreon, which will give you extras, including videos, education classes, pictures, and more. Or go to my Ko-Fi page. The links are in the show notes. Show your support of the podcast and your love of nature by supporting a Nature Wanderer t-shirt, water bottle, backpack, puzzle, or more. They can be purchased at my online store, which is linked in the show notes, or from my website. Have a great week, and above all, keep exploring the nature around you. Hello, nature lovers. Do you love to read books like I do? I've always enjoyed reading books ever since I was a kid, especially books about nature. Unfortunately, as I get older, I find myself with less and less time to sit down with a good book. I've solved that problem with Audible. Audible allows you to listen to your favorite titles while you are driving, at the gym, taking a walk, wherever you are. With all the latest titles, you'll have quite a selection to choose from. And they have podcasts too. Start listening today with a free 30-day trial. To get your free 30-day trial, go to the show notes and click on the link. Happy listening.